In the autumn of 1883, a general store in the floodplain town of Harwick, Colorado, sat dark and silent behind a crust of dried mud that reached the windowsills. The Harwick Mercantile had not opened its doors in 4 years. A spring flood had rolled through the lower basin in April of 1879, pushed 6 inches of river silt across every plank floor in town, and left standing water that lingered for 3 weeks. Most proprietors along the lower block had salvaged what they could and rebuilt on higher ground. The Mercantile's owner had done neither. He had walked away, padlocked the front door from the outside, and never returned. The building had since become a thing people walked past quickly and did not discuss, the way towns quietly agree to forget a structure that embarrasses them. The sale was held on a Tuesday morning in late October, at the edge of the crowd that gathered outside the Harwick County offices. Nora Chiles stood near the back of that crowd in a cream floral pioneer dress and a red wool shawl she had worn every working morning for 3 years. The shawl wrapped tight against a wind that came off the mesa carrying the cold of coming snow. She was 27 years old, slight, with dark auburn hair pinned in a loose bun at the nape of her neck. She held in one hand a folded receipt for the contents of her savings account, $63.40, drawn from the Harwick branch of the Colorado Territorial Bank that very morning. In the other hand, she held a small leather satchel that had belonged to her uncle, and inside it were 2 tools she had carried since his death: a 14-inch iron pry bar, slightly bent at the tip from years of hard use, and a set of 9 lockpicks machined from carbon steel, nested in a piece of oiled chamois cloth. The auctioneer called the mercantile lot at 9:15. He made a brief, dry speech about the parcel, covering the building's dimensions, the state of the floor, and the padlock condition. He noted that no interior assessment had been conducted, that the lot was sold strictly as is, and that the county took no responsibility for whatever the floodwaters had left behind. One man near Nora made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Another said quietly that the place was a swamp with walls around it. Nora bid $42. There was a pause. The auctioneer looked up. A few heads turned. No second bid came. He brought the gavel down. The man who had made the sound that was not quite a laugh looked at her with something between pity and amusement as she came forward to sign the transfer papers. "You know the floor's rotted through in places," he said. "I expect so," she said, and signed her name in full. She hadn't always been in Harwick. She had come west from Pueblo 18 months prior, after her uncle Emmett died and left her his tools and the better part of his skill. Emmett Chiles had been a locksmith of some distinction, not the kind that worked a small town's annual run of lost key complaints, but the kind that banks and rail companies sent for when a vault had seized or a strong box had been lost and found again without its combination. He had spent 40 years in the trade, and in the last 12 of those years, from the time Nora was 15 until she was 26, he had taught her everything he knew. He had started with the theory of pins, the way a lock cylinder holds its position by the alignment of driver pins and key pins at a shear line, the way the smallest deviation in that alignment is the thing the lock reads as a key. He had moved from theory to practice on a workbench in his shop in Pueblo, and she had learned to feel the feedback in a pick the way other young women learn to feel tension in a length of thread on a loom. By the time she was 19, she could open a standard tumbler lock in under a minute. By 22, she had learned enough about vault mechanics to assist him on 3 jobs for the Colorado and Southern Railway. The rail company had paid Emmett well for those jobs, and Emmett had noted carefully in a small ledger he kept by his bench what each component of the work had required and who had performed it. When he died, he left her the tools and the ledger both. She had come to Harwick for a reason she had not told the auctioneer or the man who had questioned her. She had come because of a thing Emmett had mentioned twice in her presence, in the way that men of his generation sometimes mentioned things they considered none of a young woman's business. He had said that the Harwick Mercantile, before its ruination, had been a way station for certain kinds of payment and storage that its proprietor had preferred not to conduct at the bank. Emmett had been inside the building once, years before the flood, called there for a job that the proprietor had described vaguely and then canceled. He had not described what he had seen in any detail, but Nora had been present when he mentioned it to a rail surveyor who came through the shop on another matter, and what he had said was this: "There is a floor safe in that store, and it is not a small one, and I do not know who installed it, but whoever did knew what they were doing." She had remembered that. She had remembered it for years. In the weeks before she came to Harwick, she had written to the county clerk's office to ask what public records pertained to the mercantile property. The clerk had replied with a list, and she had ridden the stage from Pueblo, carrying that list and a small journal in which she had copied, by hand, the key figures she intended to verify. She spent 3 days at the county offices before the auction date, reading through the debt claim filings that the store's former owner had submitted to the court in the summer of 1879. The reading had taken time because the filings ran to 46 pages of supporting documentation, and because she read them the way Emmett had taught her to read a mechanism, not for what the document said on its face, but for the places where the tolerances were wrong, the places where a piece had been worked on after the original manufacture. She found 5 accounts in the claim filing that looked altered to her eye. Not obviously so. The figures had not been crossed out and rewritten in a different ink. The modification was subtler than that, a second pass of a pen over an original figure, the stroke slightly thicker than the original, the numeral slightly taller. She had brought a magnifying glass for this purpose, the same small brass-handled instrument Emmett had used to examine lock mechanisms too fine to read with the naked eye. Under the glass, the alterations were plain. She had not said anything to the clerk about what she noticed. She had thanked him for his time, replaced the files in order, and returned to her boarding house to write her notes. She went to bed that night knowing what she intended to bid at the auction, and she slept without difficulty. There are women like this in every era, women who prepared for what they were walking into, who did the reading, who studied the mechanism before they put a hand to it. If something about Nora's story already feels familiar to you, stay close. The most important part of it is still sealed. The key to the padlock gave her no trouble. She opened it with the pick she called her third, a shallow hooked instrument that Emmett had ground himself on the wheel in his shop, and the shackle fell open with a sound like a stone dropped into still water. She pulled it free and pushed the front door inward. The smell that met her wasn't the smell of rot, precisely, though there was rot in it. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed against the movement of air for 4 years, a compound of dried mud and mildew, and something underneath those smells that she recognized after a moment as the particular mineral odor of river silt, dried hard in a confined space. The front room was dim, the windows clouded with dried mineral deposit from the flood. Shelving units stood along both walls, still holding merchandise, tins of lard, bolts of fabric stiffened by moisture and then dried into rigid shapes, a row of lanterns whose glass was filmed with brown residue. Everything sat in a 1/4 inch of hardened silt, pale gray and perfectly smooth, as if someone had poured concrete over the floor and let it cure. She stood in the front room for a while before she moved. Emmett had taught her that too. Before you do anything to a thing, look at it. Understand its condition and its geometry. Understand what the years have done to it. A man who goes straight to work on a lock without reading it first is a man who breaks things he did not intend to break. The front room was approximately 30 feet deep and 20 wide. The shelving ran floor to near ceiling on both long walls, the units still carrying their original stock in the positions where Prewitt's last arrangement had left them. The center of the room held the remnant of a display table, its legs sunk half an inch into the hardened silt, holding a collection of tin goods whose labels had been dissolved by the floodwater and redeposited as a pale residue across the surfaces. The counter at the far end of the front room ran the full width of the space and was made of a heavy oak plank, dark stained with water, its surface still bearing the marks of a heavy scale that had stood on it for years and left an impression in the wood. Nora noted all of this. She noted the stain patterns on the shelving that showed the flood's high water point, approximately 3 inches from the floor, the water having come in under the front door rather than over the sill. She noted which sections of the floor were in heaviest foot traffic patterns, worn smooth even through the silt crust. She noted the position of the counter and the placement of the back room door. Then she set her satchel on the nearest shelf and opened it. She had brought the pry bar, the picks, and 2 things she had added on her own, a folding rule graduated in inches and a small hand broom made of sorghum bristle. She took the broom first. The searching took the better part of 4 days. She had learned from Emmett that floor safes of the kind installed in commercial buildings before 1875 followed one of 3 general patterns in their placement. They were almost never centered in a room, because that placement made them obvious, and because the weight of a fully loaded floor safe would over time cause the surrounding planks to compress unevenly, creating a visible depression that defeated the purpose. They were more commonly set in one of 2 positions. The first was close against a weight-bearing wall, where the structural support of the wall itself distributed the safe's load. The second was in a secondary room at the back of the building, where foot traffic from the public would not cross them, and where a proprietor could conduct his private accounts with some privacy from customers at the front counter. She swept the silt from the floor in methodical 3-foot lanes, starting at the back wall of the main room and working forward. The silt came up in dry sheets where it had hardened, peeling from the planks in strips that she collected in a canvas sack she had brought for the purpose. Beneath it, the plank floor was stained dark by the floodwater, but largely intact. She tested each board with the heel of her boot as she cleared it, listening for the quality of sound beneath each strike. Most boards returned a solid contact note. A few near the northwest corner where a section of roof had admitted water long after the flood had softened to the point where they flexed under her weight. She found nothing under the main room floor. On the second day, she moved into the back room, which had once served as the store's office and storeroom combined. The door between the rooms had swollen shut with moisture, and she had to lever it open with the pry bar, working it in the gap between the door and the frame until the wood gave. The back room was smaller and darker, with one window facing the alley that ran behind the building, and it smelled more strongly of silt, because the flood had entered here through a low foundation vent that still bore the waterline mark, a dark tide stripe 4 inches up the wall. She swept the back room's floor on the second afternoon and most of the third morning. The silt here was thicker, packed in places to the depth of a full inch where it had settled after the floodwater receded slowly. She worked the 3-foot lanes, sack after sack, until the plank floor was clear beneath her broom. On the third morning, near the base of the back wall where a heavy oak counter had once stood, she found a seam in the floor that did not belong there. It was not visible to the eye exactly. What she noticed first was the sound. She was testing planks with her boot heel in the section she had just swept when one section of 3 boards together returned a note with a slight hollowness beneath the solid strike, a resonance that lasted a half-beat longer than the boards around it. She crouched and ran her fingertips along the plank edges in that section. What she felt was an edge that had been planed smooth, slightly smoother than the surrounding floorboards, and when she pressed the tip of the pry bar into the gap at one side of the section and applied slow, even downward pressure, the gap widened fractionally, confirming that these 3 boards were not nailed to the joists below in the ordinary way. She did not force it. Emmett had taught her that. Force is the method of men who do not want to understand what they are working with. Attention is the method of someone who intends to open a thing cleanly and leave it intact. She spent the rest of the 3rd day working the edges of the panel with the pry bar, feeling for the catch or the hinge that held it down. She found the hinge first, on the left side, a heavy iron piece set flush in a routed channel so that it sat level with the surrounding floor. The catch was on the right, a spring latch mechanism that had seized with the rust of 4 flood-wet years. She worked the latch with pick oil she had brought in a small glass vial, dropping 3 or 4 drops into the mechanism and waiting, then working it gently with her narrowest pick, the one she called her first, which Emmett had described as being suited for the fine work, the thing that needs to be coaxed rather than turned. She had been in Harwick for 3 weeks and had enough money left for another 10 days at the boarding house where she was staying. She did not rush. If there is one thing the practice of locks teaches a person, it is that patience and attention together are a kind of force that no spring mechanism can permanently resist. The latch gave on the evening of the 3rd day. The access panel swung upward on its hinge and rested against the baseboard. Below it, in a chamber built between the floor joists and the foundation, sat a safe. It was a Mosler floor model, which she recognized by the configuration of the dial face and the 2-handle pull design. Mosler had been making floor safes for commercial use since the late 1860s, and this one appeared to be from the early years of that period, a model she had seen only in the catalog that Emmett kept on his workshop shelf. The body was cast iron, painted black, approximately 18 inches square at the door face, bolted through its base plate to the concrete footing below. It was dry. The chamber around it had protected it from the flood entirely, the access panel above serving as a kind of cap that had kept the worst of the silt water from penetrating. There was dust on the door face and a skin of surface rust on the dial mechanism, but the safe was, by every visible measure, intact. She looked at it for a long time before she touched it. The combination dial on a Mosler floor safe of this period operated on a 4-number sequence, right, left, with a total of 100 positions on the wheel. Emmett had worked one once, a seized unit recovered from a bank failure in Trinidad in 1876, and he had written the job up in his ledger with a level of detail that Nora had read and reread after his death. She had his ledger in the satchel. She took it out that evening at the boarding house, went through the relevant entry, and returned to the mercantile the following morning with the appropriate picking tool, a listening instrument, a small stethoscope fitted with a jeweler's attachment that could be pressed to the safe body near the lock mechanism to amplify the sound of the drive cam rotating against the wheels. She worked the dial through the morning of the 4th day. Emmett's notes on Mosler mechanics were precise. The drive cam on a 4-wheel model of this period clicked once at each contact point as the wheel it was advancing completed its rotation, and by counting those clicks carefully while rotating the dial, she could identify the number of wheels in the drivetrain and then begin the slower process of isolating the contact points of each individual wheel, the position at which each one reached its gate and held. The work required stillness and a quality of attention that was almost physical in its demands, as if the body had to agree to go quiet so that the ears could work fully. She knelt on the bare plank floor beside the open chamber, the stethoscope pressed to the side of the safe body just forward of the drivetrain, and she turned the dial in small, even increments, one position at a time, letting each position come to rest fully before moving to the next. The surface rust on the dial face had roughened the wheel slightly, and the drag of it was not quite uniform around the full rotation, but Emmett had warned her about that. A Mosler mechanism of this age, he had written, may have surface irregularity from oxidation that produces a false sensation of contact. Count only the audible click. The click is the truth. The feel of the dial is not. She counted. She recorded each contact position in the small journal in her breast pocket, writing the number and the wheel number in a column beside her running notes. The first contact point settled at position 41, the second at 17. She worked forward from there, resetting the dial and running the sequence again to verify, the way Emmett had taught her. Confirm the first number twice before you advance. Confidence in what you have already found is the only thing that makes the next thing findable. The third contact point seated at 68. She worked without hurrying. She worked without expecting anything to come quickly. She worked the way Emmett had taught her to work, as if the lock were a conversation and she were listening, not speaking. The fourth contact point seated at 2:30 in the afternoon. She pressed the left handle and then the right, and the bolt mechanism released, and the door swung outward on its hinge, and the air that came out of the safe was cold and dry, and carried a faint smell of paper and metal and old wax, the smell of a thing that had been sealed and undisturbed since the last hand to open it had pushed it shut. Inside the safe were 3 shelves. The top shelf held a tin box, approximately 8 inches by 6, with a hinged lid. The middle shelf held a paper-wrapped bundle tied with cotton string. The bottom shelf held a leather bag, flat and square, the kind used to carry coin in quantity. Nora did not open any of them that afternoon. She sat back on her heels and looked at what was there, and she let herself do the thing Emmett had always cautioned her about doing too quickly. She let herself understand the weight of what she had found. She had known, coming into this, that the Mercantile's former owner was a man named Aldous Prewitt, who had operated the store from 1871 until the flood year of 1879, a period of 8 years, during which, according to the records she had researched at the county offices before the auction, he had extended credit to a considerable number of small account holders in the Horrock area, farmers and homesteaders and miners, men and women who had purchased on account through the slow seasons and settled up at harvest, or when a claim came in. She had known that the flood year had been a ruin for many of those account holders too, that the flood had struck the lower basin at a particularly vulnerable moment in the agricultural calendar, and that several of the homesteads in the valley had been abandoned in the months that followed the spring of 1879. She had also known from a different set of county records that Prewitt had filed a debt claim statement with the county court in the summer of 1879, 3 months after the flood, asserting outstanding balances owed to the Mercantile by 16 named account holders. The aggregate of those claim balances was $412. Prewitt had requested a lien on certain personal property held by the account holders in question as partial recovery of his losses. Nora had read those claim filings with the same careful attention she brought to a lock mechanism, and what she had noticed, reading them, was that the amounts were wrong, not wrong in an accidental way, wrong in a way that required a particular kind of attention to the original account books to detect. She had found the original account books in the county clerk's archive, filed as supporting exhibits to the claim, and those books, in several of the accounts she examined, showed entries made in 2 different hands. The amounts that had been entered in the neat, even hand she took to be Prewitt's original bookkeeping did not match the amounts that had been entered on top of them in a slightly different hand, heavier pressed, as if the writer had been working under urgency. The differences were not large. $3 here, $7 there, once a difference of $14 on an account that had originally shown a credit balance of $2.16. But they were there, and they were consistent, and they all ran in the same direction, upward, in favor of the store. She had taken careful notes. She opened the tin box first. Inside were folded sheets of paper, 9 of them, each one a handwritten account summary, in the neat hand that she recognized as the original bookkeeping. Each summary bore a name and a balance. She compared them one by one against the notes she had taken from the county record. Every one of them was different from the filed claims. Every one of them was lower. She sat with each page for a full minute before she moved to the next. She did not read quickly. Each page was a family's name and a number, and the difference between the number on that page and the number Prewitt had filed with the court was the size of the claim he had manufactured against them. She noted each name. She noted each amount. The names were the names of people who had farmed or ranched or mined in the Harwick Basin, and some of those names she recognized from the county records she had read, the records that showed which homesteads had been sold under duress in the 2 years following the flood, and which families had left the valley entirely. The account of a woman named Clara Mapes showed a balance of $7.04. The claim Prewitt had filed against her showed $31. Clara Mapes's property had been sold in the spring of 1880 for the satisfaction of a lien that should never have existed. She opened the paper bundle next. Inside were receipts, 40 or more of them, organized in rough chronological order and covering the years 1871 to 1879. They were payment receipts signed by customers, acknowledging that they had paid particular amounts against their accounts on particular dates. She cross-referenced 3 of them against the filing. In each case, the payment recorded on the receipt had been made, and in each case the original account book showed the reduction that payment should have caused. In each case, the filed claim had ignored the payment and carried the original balance forward, as if the payment had never occurred. The leather bag held coin, silver dollars and half-dollars, counted out later to a total of $91.20. She did not know what Prewitt had intended the bag for. It might have been his reserves against the flood season. It might have been something else. What she knew sitting on the silt-dusty floor of the back room of the Harwick Mercantile on the afternoon of the 4th day of October, 1883, was that Aldous Prewitt had filed false debt claims against 16 families in the year of their greatest loss. She knew this because the true accounts, written in his own hand and sealed in a safe that the flood had not touched, said so plainly. He had locked the truth in the floor and walked away from it, and the truth had waited there through 4 flood-wash seasons for a hand that could reach it. There is a particular kind of justice that does not announce itself. It arrives in the form of a receipt, a balance sheet, a column of figures that someone wrote honestly and then hid, not knowing that honesty sealed in iron survives everything else. She found the county records office still open at 4 o'clock when she arrived with the tin box and the bundle of receipts tucked carefully in her satchel. The clerk on duty was a man named Theo Marsh, who was 20 years older than Nora and had worked in that office long enough to have processed the original Prewitt claim filings himself. He looked at what she put on the counter with the expression of a man who had not expected his afternoon to require anything of him. She explained what she had found. She showed him the tin box and the receipts. She showed him her notes from the original filings, the column of paired figures, the amounts filed versus the amounts in the tin box, the receipts that confirmed payments that the filing had ignored. She set the magnifying glass on the counter and showed him the altered entries in the original account books through it, the place where a second pen had thickened a numeral over the original. She did not editorialize. She laid the documents out in order and let him read them. He read for a long time. He picked up the magnifying glass and held it over 2 or 3 of the account book pages himself, moving slowly down the columns with the glass, and she watched his face for the moment when the altered entries became clear to him. That moment came. He set the glass down. "Where did you find these?" he said when he had finished. "Under the floor," she said. There were 16 families named in Prewitt's original claim. By November of 1883, the county court had vacated the liens on 11 of the properties still held by those families or their descendants, on the strength of the original account summaries and the payment receipts Nora had brought forward. The remaining 5 were properties that had already been sold out of those families' hands and could not be recovered by lien vacatur alone. The court noted those cases in the record as findings of fraudulent claim without available remedy, which was the court's formal way of saying that what had been done to those families was wrong and that the wrong could not be undone. The judge who heard the filings was a man of careful speech named Alcott, who had presided over debt matters in the Horrocks district for 11 years. He reviewed the tin box documents and the receipt bundle over the course of 2 sessions. In the second session, he asked Nora to describe the condition of the floor safe at the time she found it, and she described it with the same precision she had used for everything else: the silt seal on the access panel, the dry condition of the chamber, the surface rust on the dial, the 4-wheel Mosler mechanism, and the method she had used to isolate its contact points. Judge Alcott listened without interruption, and when she finished, he asked no follow-up questions, which she took to mean that what she had said was sufficient. The lien on the Harwick hardware proprietor's property was among those vacated. He was a man named Gil Cutter, who had arrived in Harwick in 1880, a year after the flood, and had purchased a property he had not known carried Prewitt's lien against it. When the judge vacated the lien in November, Cutter stood in the courthouse hall and said nothing for a moment. "I didn't know there was a lien," he said at last. "There isn't one now," she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man assembling a picture from its parts. "You bought the mercantile," he said. "The one everyone walked past." "I did," she said, "for $42. She said nothing to that. Prewitt himself was located in Denver, where he had been living since 1880. He was notified by the court of the finding. There is no record of his response. The county court's jurisdiction in debt matters did not extend to criminal proceedings, and the amount of time that had elapsed since the original filings made certain remedies impractical. The court's finding was entered in the public record. The record said in the careful language of county courts that the claims had been found to be based on accounts that did not reflect the actual balances owed at the time of filing. It was enough. That was what Nora had decided it needed to be. The truth was in the record now, and the liens were gone. And the families who still held their land held it free of a claim that had never been honestly made. What Prewitt made of that in Denver was his own matter. Of the $91.20 in the leather bag, she turned over $60 to the county for distribution among the families as partial restitution against the costs those liens had imposed. $60 was a modest amount against 4 years of encumbered title, but it was the amount the safe had held, less the cost of Nora's room and supplies for the month she had spent in Horrocks. And she was not in the habit of drawing from a fund that did not belong to her. She kept the mercantile. A woman named Ida Breck, who had lived in Harwick for 30 years and whose husband had died in the flood year, came to see the building in early November after the court proceedings were finished. She had heard what Nora had found, as everyone in Harwick had heard by then, and she had come not to speak of that, but to ask whether Nora intended to do anything with the space. "I haven't decided," Nora said. They were standing in the back room, where the access panel was still propped open against the wall, the safe visible below. Ada looked at the open chamber for a moment. She was a tall woman, gray-haired, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have absorbed a great deal of difficulty and have not been diminished by it. She stood looking at the open safe for long enough that Nora did not try to fill the silence. My husband bought dry goods here, Ida said at last, for 10 years before Prewitt closed it up. He paid his account honest every time. I know, Nora said. His was one of the summaries in the box. Ida looked at her then, a direct look that carried something in it that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief, but belonged to the same country as both. He died in August of the flood year, Ida said. Before the court filed the lien against us, I paid it. I did not know what else to do. Nora was quiet for a moment. The court's finding is in the record now, she said. What was filed against you was wrong. That is what the record says. Ida nodded once, a small motion that did not require any more words. The November light came through the back window of the store at a low angle and lay across the plank floor in a pale stripe, crossing the edge of the open access panel and falling into the safe chamber below. What do you mean to do with the tools? Ida said at last, nodding at the satchel. Keep working, Nora said. That winter she began the repair of the floor in the front room, pulling the softened boards from the northwest corner and replacing them with new lumber, cut at a mill 12 miles up the valley. She did the framing work herself, setting the new joists with the attention to level that Emmett had drilled into her over years of watching him work. Because he had told her once that the thing most often wrong with a finished floor was a lazy man who had not checked his framing. She checked hers with the folding rule at every course. The work went slowly because she was working alone, and because the existing framing in the northwest corner had to be partially recut where it had taken water damage across the top edge of the joists. She used a draw knife for that, pulling the blade toward her in long, even passes until the damaged wood was clear and the fresh grain showed white and clean beneath it. She set the new joists on 2-inch ledger boards, toe-nailed to the original sill plate, checking plumb on each one with a 4-foot level she had borrowed from a carpenter 2 blocks over, a quiet man named Royce who had lent it without asking why she needed it. By February, the front room floor was sound, every plank fitting snug against its neighbor with the slight seasonal gap Emmett had specified for pine, enough to allow for the wood's movement across a full year of dry and wet. She had begun replacing the warped and mineral-frosted glass in the windows with new panes ordered from a supplier in Pueblo, cutting each pane to fit with a glazier's diamond she had bought at the hardware, which was Gil Cutter's store, and he had charged her the fair price and said nothing extra about it. She had not reopened the store to commerce yet. She was not in a hurry. Theo Marsh came by in February to let her know that the court had certified the last of the vacated liens. He stood in the doorway of the front room, looking at the new floorboards and the clean windows. "You did good work here," he said. She set down the planing tool she had been using on the window frame and considered the floor. "The floor's level," she said. "The rest still needs attention." She meant the store, and she meant the work, and she may have meant more than either of those things. Theo Marsh seemed to understand that she did not need him to say more. He touched the brim of his hat and went back out into the February street. She stood alone in the front room of the Harwick Mercantile for a while after he left, looking at the work she had done and the work that remained. The light was clear and cold through the new window glass. The floor was level and solid underfoot, and the planks she had set were pale against the dark of the flood-stained originals, a record of where the water had been and where the repair had come in behind it, a record of what the flood had not been able to take. She picked up the planing tool and went back to work. The pry bar lay in the open satchel on the shelf where she had left it, the slight bend at its tip unchanged, the same tool Emmett had pressed into her hands on a morning in Pueblo 12 years ago and told her to learn the weight of it, because a tool is only as good as the hand that knows it. She knew it. The window frame came level at the end of the afternoon, and she measured it twice, and she was satisfied. If you have ever found something true buried under years of silence, something that no one else had gone looking for, tell us about it in the comments below. Stories like this one do not end when the work is done. There is always another floor to clear, another account to read honest. You will find the next one waiting just ahead.